Hi, and welcome to our next webinar in the CPRA Law and Tech series. This is a series put on jointly by the Future of Privacy Forum and the California Lawyers Association Privacy Law section. We've covered a lot of ground in these last 4 or 5 weeks, and if you go to either of our websites, you'll be able to see recordings of those past calls. And I think you'll find them very educational. Today, we are fortunate to be able to have experts who will be addressing a very confusing topic to many of us who practice in this space, lawyers that is, and that is universal opt-outs and global privacy controls. Just by way of introduction, I'm Sherry Porath-Rockwell, and I'm a privacy and cyber attorney at Sidley Austin. I'm in Los Angeles. And I'm also the chair of the California Lawyers Association Privacy Law section. I'm going to hand it over to my co-host now, Stacey Gray from Future of Privacy Forum, to let you know more about today and introduce our speakers.
Thank you so much, Sherry. A pleasure to be here and be co-hosting this series with the California Lawyers Association Privacy Law Division. I'm Stacey Gray. I'm the Director of Legislative Research and Analysis at the Future of Privacy Forum. And like Sherry mentioned, we've been running this series of Tech for Lawyers, CPRA Law Plus Tech series each Friday afternoon in March and February of 2022. So good afternoon and happy Friday again. Our previous sessions are listed here, and like Sherry mentioned, you can find them at either of our websites. You can find the slides and the recordings on any of these very important topics. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by a couple of guest experts on the topic of global privacy controls. I'll briefly introduce.
I'm just going to jump in because I think something's wrong potentially with the deck.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we're stuck on the first slide is obscuring that. There you go. That's better.
Huh. Okay. It looks good now?
Yes.
All right.
Perfect. Yeah.
We're on a roll. Okay. You can find biographical information about our two guest speakers on our website. So I'll just briefly say that Dr. Rob Van Eyck is a friend and colleague at the Future Privacy Forum. He's our EU Managing Director, but also relatedly holds a PhD in programmatic advertising from Leiden University and was a senior technologist for the Dutch Data Protection Authority for almost 10 years prior to FPF, where he represented the Dutch DPA specifically in negotiations around do not track. So highly relevant to today's conversation. Tanvi Vyas is a principal engineer at Mozilla, where she's advocating for a more private web for all users and leads the development of privacy features in Firefox, including enhanced tracking protection, Firefox containers, identity segregation system, and she'll tell you more about that. Tanvi is also the co-chair of the W3C Privacy Community Group. So by way of very brief introduction, and then I'm going to turn this completely over to our guest experts, I wanted to give people a sense of what we're talking about today. And in case you weren't sure why you signed up, what we're talking about, what are global privacy controls? If you're a privacy lawyer in the United States right now, you are aware that a number of new United States state privacy laws are requiring companies to respect individual requests to opt out of particular activities. This is not all that the new privacy laws do, but it's a core piece of many of them in the United States. Typically, those opt-outs are around activities such as sale, targeted advertising, and in some cases, profiling, defined differently in different states. One of the major challenges of operationalizing these kinds of opt-outs, both for businesses and for individuals, is that requests often have to be made to each company individually, each company specifically. And so there have been a number of reports on the challenges, including one that I've highlighted here from Consumer Reports' Digital Lab, which is well worth a read if you have not read this already. And in response to some of those challenges, some new and proposed legislation goes further and requires companies to respect what are called universal opt-out requests. And just to set the stage, I've put an example here of legislative text from the newly passed Colorado Privacy Act, which shows you what this looks like in legislative language. which is that controllers or businesses must allow or may allow consumers to exercise their opt-out rights through a user-selected universal opt-out mechanism. So this has been unsurprisingly somewhat controversial, particularly in the business community, while being lauded by privacy advocates, and is a core piece of the legislative trend in the United States right now. So what are these? I'm going to turn it over now first to Tanvi.
Hi, thank you, Stacy. So over the last decade, we've seen a lot of well-meaning pro-privacy legislation established, but without with a limited understanding of the tech that's behind it, the consequences of that legislation, we've created a usability problem on the internet, and where we see these consent prompts left and right that interrupt the user's task and provide unclear expectations. So what we're here to talk about today is a universal opt-out method or a global privacy control. So users who want to universally opt out of tracking instead of page by page have an option to do so, and how legislation can help us get to that point. Next slide, please. So before we get into the specifics of opt-outs, Rob is going to go over some of the basic tech concepts on how browsers work and how tracking works. Then I'll go through some of the history of opt-outs, the past, present, and the future. And then hand it back to Rob to give a couple examples of HTTP header expressions and end with some Q&A. Rob, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Let me share my screen here. And let me select the PowerPoint show. Here we go. So what we see here is a simplification of what happens when you visit a website. And to help us understand the complexities of universal opt-outs, it's good to understand how the device and the software works that you're actually using on a day-to-day basis. And what you see here on the left is a rectangular, which simplifies the web browser. Obviously, there's like the bar on the top where you can type in the URL as the web page that's then loaded. And obviously, most of the web pages today contain advertisements. And we're going to decompose one of these ads, like the refreshing beer bottles shown on the page. And after this like short introduction, you will understand how all the elements that are actually visualized on your screen are communicating with advertising technology companies in the background. And specifically because we're talking about a very developed state of technology in terms of advertising, this all happens in a blink of a second. So let me turn to the next slide to decompose this ad. So if we look at the ad here, and if you actually look under the hood from a technical perspective, this ad is basically a mini web page that's loaded. It's a mini web page within the web page that you're actually visiting. And here you see a double click powered advertisement, and the URL is still active. And it consists of, and the table is in Dutch, unfortunately, but I'll explain. It consists of a number of different elements. The first one is a so-called CSS document, 14 stacked images, 5 JavaScripts, and a call to an API. And how that then looks like when we decompose this advertisement, you see all the different, transparent images loaded here. And to make sure that this actually becomes almost like a video, to create the illusion of an ad being presented towards you with the, basically with the lemons in the background also coming towards you, and the ice cubes, etc., and the water also bubbling up. That's all done by manipulating the position and the size of the images. And of course, you need programming code to do so. This is where the JavaScripts come into play, but also in order to manipulate the size and the position on the screen of the picture, pictures, you need the CSS, so-called style sheets. So without going into detail what JavaScripts and style sheets are, I think it's good to realize that in this mini web page is actually a very clever way of compiling together the minimum amount of information you need to create such a video. Oh, this obviously is much smaller package in terms of size to communicate across the network than a video would be. So it's quite an interesting accomplishment, so to say. So if we go to then basically zooming in a little bit to how does the browser actually make sense of what it receives when you start loading such a mini web page. And in order to better understand how the browser works, I decomposed the browser in 6 different elements. The first one will be the user interface. Then we have a component called the rendering engine. There's a browser engine. There's a JavaScript interpreter. We just briefly use the programming language that's often used on the web to display and to program. It's the JavaScript language. There's also the networking component and the data storage. The data storage is an interesting one because this is where all the cookie discussions happen and take place, but there's also a lot of innovation on the types of storage that is available for a programmer in a browser. So let us quickly run through these 6 different elements.
Rob, may I jump in really briefly?
Yes. Yes.
Apologies, we've heard from a couple of people that it's a little hard to hear you. And I know that's because of the mic trouble we were having earlier. So, but I just wanted to relay it.
Let's do a sound check here. Is this better?
Folks want to put in the chat if it's a little better?
Just test. Is this better? Yes, I see a hand raised. Yeah. So I'm gonna just pull up the microphone volume here a little bit on my end to make sure I keep the mic a little bit more closer to me.
There we go. Well. I think that's better. Yeah, this is important stuff, so we wanted to make sure folks can hear you.
And also the session is being recorded, so we want to make sure the audio quality is good. So
great.
What we see here in the first component is the user interface, and I just basically removed everything that's outside of the user interface here. And what you see here are common elements like sometimes even hidden in the default settings, like file and edit and view and history and bookmarks, etc. But the user interface gives you the ability to get to these different configuration settings. And the most important part here is, of course, the part where you enter the address, where you, but also it's basically a gateway to communicating with the default search bar. And once you start navigating the web, the forward and the backward button are also 2 elements that belong to the user interface. The main function of the user interface is to connect the backend of the user interface with the operating system, which is like the Windows 11 or iOS or any other operating system you may prefer in order to accomplish the tasks that you have to do. The second component is the rendering engine, and the main task of the rendering engine is to display the web page. So what you see on the left in these 3 different rectangles is on the left is the HTTP code. This is basically it's the language in which the web page is programmed, HTML. Sorry, I just said HTTP. There are a lot of acronyms in the internet world, but this is the so-called markup language. It's a structured language describing all the different elements that are needed to interact with the different images that we've seen when we decompose the ad. The rendering engine basically interprets all these lines and codes line by line, and basically represents then what this should be for a normal human. And this is then the beer bottle. And so the code on the left actually represents the beer bottle on the right. And even more so, it includes all the JavaScripts needed to animate the beer bottle to make sure it appears to be moving towards you. So that's the rendering engine. Then the browser engine has the function to connect the 2 together. So the user interface, which we started with, the rendering engine, and then there's the browser engine, basically the blue box around it that links the two interfaces together. The JavaScript interpreter is basically the programming engine, which makes sense when the programming of the beer bottle is being parsed line by line. And it does so in a very structured way. It uses two types of data structures. The first one is the so-called DOM, the document object model. You can forget about these acronyms straight away, but it's the reason why I put them in here is to understand that you need some kind of data structure to be able to point to, okay, this is the image number 1 of the advertisement, and this is image number 2. And in order to move them around on specific places on the web's screen, you need the second data storage. It's called the CSS, the object model. Anyways, the line to take home is the JavaScript interpreter is which makes basically is the part that makes the web page smart and allows the programmer to interact with all the different components on the screen. I am going to go to the 5th component, which is the networking component. And this is the element where you start you're seeing connections to the outside, connection to servers. Obviously, we've seen that we were looking at an advertisement, which was a mini web page within the web page that you're actually visiting, which makes it clear that you're not actually communicating with one web server, you're communicating with multiple web servers. And in the attack space, it's even so that you could actually be communicating with hundreds of web servers at the same time. And the networking component takes care of all these complexities. Then we have the 6th component, is basically the beginning of the web was not very smart. It was like a book. You could turn the one page to the other, but there was no way to remember what you actually saw on the previous page. And this is where the cookie storage was developed. And in order to be able to store a cookie, it's basically, you need a way to be able to programmatically get access to the content of these data storages. And this is where JavaScript comes in. It has access, so modern browsers have access to the web APIs, and an API is an application programming interface, which stands for, it's a whole library of different programming techniques a developer or a website creator can use to get access to the data storage. Data storage is a way to add memory to the user to a web page, and to be able, for instance, to remember what was the book that I wanted to buy and put in the shopping basket. And if you want to go into like a flow to where you have like you want to check out and pay for the purchases you've put in the shopping basket, obviously you will visit several pages in this flow, and you need to be able to collect and retain the information that's in the shopping basket and to calculate the amount due. For a programmer, there are different ways to get access to the various components, and I'm going to skip most of these bullets. I just want to point you to the last bullet. Modern browsers not just have storages to basically retain cookies. There are other types of storages like mini databases, but there's so-called index databases. There's also cache storage, which means that once an image has been loaded, it does not have to be loaded from the web server again. But there's also a thing called local storage and session storage. And these are types of storages which programmers use to retain, for instance, unique identifiers, like could be an email address, could be a unique identifier that's connected to a login attempt, or also making sure that if you have like a secure connection to your bank and you've entered your login and your password, to make sure that it's clear that it's you that's visiting that website, and it's you that, and not somebody else who's hijacking the connection to your bank's web server. And so these 6 bullets cache storage, IndexedDB, servers, worker registrations, cookies, local storage, and session storage. These are like typical data storages that I look at when I open the hood of the web browser to look at, okay, is there anything already stored before I gave consent when I visited this website? This is all the tracking discussion and cookie banner discussion that we'll briefly touch on later in this presentation as well. These are the so-called storage places, the storage mechanisms in browsers where I will look into. So having painted a little bit of the 6 basic building blocks of the browser, I hope we can get to this explanation where I try to differentiate between how browsers actually handle cookies, and there are like slight differences between the browsers. I've limited the overview to Chrome, Firefox, and Safari. And I also looked at, okay, what we're talking about here are cookies in a so-called third-party context. And the importance here on this third-party context, let's see, because I'm missing like one slide in the presentation. Go back once. Oh. No, it's not showing. But what it does is that if I visit, for instance, fpf.org, and fpf.org places a cookie on my in my browser, that's called the first-party context. But if Google Analytics, who is also available for us to understand with how many visitors are actually visiting the FPF website, wants to drop a cookie, then that Google cookie is called a so-called cookie in a third-party context. And it's important to understand when we're talking about advertising and tracking that there are differences in the default settings between browsers. The Chrome browser does not have any restriction at the moment in terms of dropping cookies in a third-party context. For instance, if Google Analytics is present on a website, then these websites will place these cookies automatically. In Firefox, however, there's access restricted for known trackers. And this is called the smart block technology. Well, as far as I know, it's based on a standard list, which is maintained by Disconnect. And I'm going to hand to Thani in a second, because I want to complete the story here by pointing towards Safari first, which has a technology which is more based on algorithms, and it's called the intelligent tracking protection. And the thing to understand here is visualized on the fourth row. Again, it's basically the default setting. The blocking by Firefox is enabled by default, as is as well the intelligent tracking protection, the algorithmic approach by Apple. And again, users are not protected by default on the Google browser. So maybe you want to add a little bit to the enhanced tracking protection or the smart block, Thani?
Yes. So in Firefox and in Safari, we block various third-party cookies and storage mechanisms. And this can sometimes cause like web compatibility issues, which is one reason that Firefox uses a list of known trackers provided by Disconnect and blocks those by default. But what about all the other third parties? And so Firefox is working on a protection called total cookie protection, where instead of just the ones on the list, we look at all third parties. And instead of blocking their cookies, we isolate them or partition them. So they're only available for that site and can't be used across site. So that is a technology that we're working on. It is available in our private browsing mode and in our stricter modes of enhanced tracking protection.
Yeah, it's good to complement that. We're all talking about the deprecation of cookies here as well. This is actually against the background. Google announced to no longer support third-party cookies, which is then what we mean cookies in a third-party context by late next year. And this is why you see so much on the internet when it's about, okay, but what about the future of advertising technology? Will my technology still work because it heavily relies on third-party cookies? I hope you start to understand a little bit the importance of the default settings in a browser related to the capabilities of storing cookies in a browser. Obviously, everybody agrees it's necessary to have the ability to add memory to the browser, such that we get a really rich experience when we visit web pages. But there's also a lot of privacy questions that raise from the different technologies that we see in current browsers. And most of the technology is already more than 20 years old. If I, out of the top of my head, the cookie was invented half the late 90s. So that's like more than, I think it's 1996, around that time. So that's quite a long time. And obviously the technology is evolving, and that's why it's good that we're now thinking through, okay, how does the internet look? How do browsers look when we start converting towards an internet that does not allow for third-party cookies anymore? And that's to say that's for the Chrome browser at the moment only. Then to my last slide before I hand to, well, actually, this is my last slide, right? And I'm going to hand back to Tanvi for the continuation of that presentation. And I'm going to stop sharing here. There we go.
Stacy, can you share? Thank you. Okay, so the technology around opt-outs has evolved over the years. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the history. Next slide, please. So first, the past. So users have been able to opt out of targeting with third-party cookies for the last couple decades with opt-out cookies, which I'll describe. And then also a little more than a decade ago, there was the Do Not Track initiative, and I'll get into that. So first, opt-out cookies. So there's various sites that you could visit that let you opt out of targeting advertisement. So one is the Networking Advertising Initiatives website or the Digital Advertising Alliance website. You go through this opt-out flow where it's a tool where you see multiple advertisers: Google, Yahoo, Taboola, Criteo, Quantcast. Some of them have dozens, some of them have more than 100. And you click a button that says opt out, like you can check individual or you can opt out in general. And what that results in is actually your browser setting a third-party cookie that says opt me out of Criteo tracking or Quantcast tracking. So it's a Quantcast cookie or Criteo cookie or Taboola or Yahoo or Google cookie. And that lets them know when they see you again on a site, not to show them not to show that user targeted advertising. And that's all it does. It doesn't actually remove any cookies that they already have from your website. And so it doesn't actually stop them from identifying you and collecting information about you. It just prevents them from taking that information and then showing you a targeted ad. Also, if you decide to delete your cookies, you also end up deleting all these opt-out cookies, and you have to go opt out again, which I don't think users have full understanding of. And although these tools still exist, I don't see them used as much in practice today for a few reasons. First, as Rob mentioned, browsers have started to isolate or block these third-party cookies to actually mitigate cross-site tracking. So these opt-out tools from NAI and DAA don't work in all browsers anymore. And moreover, as I mentioned, they're not really a privacy solution for users. They prevent you from seeing targeted ads, but they don't prevent the collection of behavioral information about you. So your behavioral data is still being collected. So then came the Do Not Track initiative, which started off really well. There was a cross-industry working group. A number of companies said that they would adhere to the signal. I saw companies invest resources in figuring out how to adhere to the signal. A lot of browsers implemented the header. There was a user interface where users could easily turn it on or off globally in that browser. Definitely better than the opt-out third-party cookie situation. And it was for more than just targeted advertising, but for tracking itself.
I'm just going to jump in for a second, just as the lawyer in the room. So can you explain what a header is?
Yes. Yes, and I
in
will
the context of what you just said with the do not track signal. Yep.
Yes. So when your browser makes a request and it goes to a server, any server, it sends an HTTP header. It sends a lot of HTTP headers. And that tells you, what is the user agent? What are the cookies? What are certain browser settings that you have? And in one of those headers is the do not track header. And that one is set. When that header is set, that tells the server that, hey, this user doesn't want to be tracked. And that's sent to every place that you can visit on the internet from that specific device, that specific browser. So you do need to set this in each browser that you use, or you in the past. I'll talk about what the future looks like.
Maybe a good analogy is as well like an envelope. And if you add like the address and the street and the zip code could be a header by itself, isn't it? That's like the header. It's not what's in there, it's the content. Like the images we saw, like the beer bottle would be part of the content, but where to basically send the image of the beer bottle, because it needs to come from a server, that's all on the envelope itself. So the headers are basically contain information that is needed to make the communication work.
Yeah, it's a metadata. And so part of that metadata is the do not track header. Sherry, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. No, just some of us did not know what that was. So I wanted to, bring it down to the basics.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you.
So part of this, so do not track, all sounds great, but it did come with a downfall. And that was partly because there was no legislation that required it. It was optional. Things started to go south in the Tracking Protection Working Group. The agreement that folks had made about the do not track signal slowly dissolved to the point that the working group itself closed. And today, it's a pretty useless signal. Many browsers have removed it or are in the process of removing it because it creates a false sense of consumer protection and it cannot be enforced. There's no legislation backing it. Next slide, please. So now moving on to the present. So we have various laws in various jurisdictions, CCPA, CPRA, GDPR, e-privacy directive, et cetera. That cover notice and consent, among other things. And one of the results of these laws is that users need to click through numerous cookie banners and multi-step consent flows that might mean little to them. And some of these prompts actually use doc patterns to gain this consent. And there's a variety of consent prompt flavors, and I'll go through a few. There's even consent management platforms where their business is to sell these libraries of consent prompts. Next slide, please. I am not monitoring the chat. Stacy or Sherry, if there's a question that comes up, feel free to interrupt me. Okay.
We will, and we would just ask if people can, just as a reminder, to put your questions. It's better for us if you can put it in the Q&A as opposed to the chat. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so here we have a cookie prompt with a two-step flow. This is on IKEA's website. So first I see a notice about the use of cookies. I can say, fine, I'll accept it, or I can go into settings, into the second step. And in the second step, again, I can say, okay, that's fine, or I can say browse only with selected cookies, noting that I have not checked or analytics cookies are not checked by default. So there's no actual reject button. So I could go through this flow and still feel like I've consented to something that I shouldn't have. Here, what you have consented to is, if you go through this flow, is strictly necessary cookies. And you do actually need those. You need those to log into a site, to get your bank account details, to use your shopping cart. But users don't understand this nuance. So they're left feeling a little unsatisfied going through this flow, even if they try to go beyond fine by me, I accept. Next slide, please. Then there's prompts like this one that I found on Jamie Oliver's cooking site. And this is the full gamut of options. And I'm not even really sure which button I'm supposed to press here. So I start off and there's a green accept all button, or I can go down to different purposes, etc. And then I see various toggles to turn things on and off. Or I can click third-party vendors, and then I see like hundreds of third-party vendors. And there's both a toggle and a checkbox. I'm not sure which one means what. Sometimes when I hit the toggle, the checkbox is checked automatically. It's very confusing. Like I couldn't even figure out how to get through this consent prompt. Next slide, please. And then there's consent prompts with no options. So this one, it tells me like, okay, these are the cookies we collect. This is our privacy policy. I can either say I'm okay with that or go with cookie options. Cookie options takes me to a long page that tells me all about cookies and advertising cookies and whatnot. And then it asks me, then it says I can manage my cookies on my own if I want to. And it takes me to those sites I talked about before, the NAI or the DAA, to go through opt-out flows. And it takes me to 5 different sites to opt out of various cookies. One of them is specifically just for Google Ads. And what's interesting to note here is that when I do go to one of these sites, my browser, I think on one of them, is making 120 or something requests to these third-party trackers or advertisers to get this opt-out cookie. So it's when I make a request out to websites, those websites receive my IP address and those headers that we talked about before. So now I'm reaching out to a site that I may have never encountered before or in the future. And now they've seen my IP address, they've set this opt-out cookie. So it's kind of counterintuitive that the way to manage my cookies is actually to set multiple third-party cookies. Next slide, please.
Can I just go back and clarify something? So if
Sure.
you're saying, are you saying that if you go to one of these places and they're sending requests to other sites, like let's say soccer.com or something you may have never visited, are you saying that that soccer.com site now is gathering information about you that it would never have had because you never go to that site?
Yeah, let's say, for example, it's like obscure advertiser.com or advertiser in a specific geography.com. And I'm not in that geography, but it's on this list. Then my browser is making a request to that website, and that website got my IP address and came back and set an opt-out cookie on my browser, even though I may have never encountered this because it's an obscure advertiser in a specific geographic area.
And are they able to do anything? They have your IP address. Are you suggesting that they do things with that information?
They could. I mean, I don't know. There's fingerprinting techniques. Browsers try to protect against fingerprinting, but we can only go so far in doing that. I don't think that they can fingerprint you directly on that site because that site is managed by somebody else. But your IP address in itself, so when I say fingerprint, I mean it's a device characteristic that helps identify you. So if someone sees my IP address, they know that it's probably me or my husband or my kids or somebody who lives in my household. So your IP address itself can be identifying.
Got it.
And that kind of goes into, there's a whole fingerprinting I could do a whole nother talk on. So I'll just
yeah.
Okay, and then next slide, please. I did finally find a one-click option for these consent banners, and it was actually on the Information Commissioner's Office from the UK. And I could clearly click accept or reject. It was off by default. So that was great. And then the other one I found was on one of the consent management platforms, cookieeyes.com, that actually sells consent management as a service.
Maybe this is a good moment to add like that it's possible for some cookie banner solutions to put geolocation rules in the configuration, which means, for instance, if you have a US-based website and you don't want to subject your European visitors to Google Analytics, it's possible to basically create a rule. And I'm gonna paste the FAQ page of OneTrust in the chat to just to understand that a little bit. But it is very easy for website owners to differentiate between visitors coming from different jurisdictions, whether that's Brazil or Europe or maybe Asia, and try to then adhere to the local rules that apply to these folks who will visit your website. And this is called geolocation rules.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we've gone through these different options. So for cookie consent prompts, they interrupt a user's task, especially when they're trying to figure out how to reject cookies if they go through those extra steps. There's confusion around what this strictly necessary means. Users don't understand that is allowed by default and should be for their experience. And so these prompts could cause fear and anxiety for users, whether they click through and accept it on purpose, on accident, or even when they reject them. And there's also a question of what happens when a user opts in or opts out of these. There's an inconsistent experience. There's what guarantees do users have about this? There's no universal or global enforcement or audit mechanisms. And sometimes there's none in specific jurisdictions. This really varies by jurisdiction. So I don't think the answer here is just notice and consent laws. I think there also needs to be a privacy minimum bar that all companies need to abide by in addition to this. And I do want to note that this is even worse problem on mobile. You can't ignore these prompts. They take up the entire phone real estate. On a desktop browser, you might be on one side or another side, and you can just get through what you want to do without engaging. But on mobile, it's kind of like you're forced to engage with these prompts. So how can we do better for our users? Next slide, please. So what does the future look like? So we've talked about these single website opt-out, opt-in flows. What we need is really some kind of global privacy control where you don't need to do this on a per site basis. And in order to achieve something like this, we need informed legislation, and we need to really think about putting guardrails around meaningful consent. Next slide, please. So there's actually a specification called Global Privacy Control. It's a proposal in the W3C Privacy Community Group. And what is it? It's a header. It's an HTTP header. As we talked about this metadata, the same way DNT was, this one here says sec GPC 1:1. So that signal sent from a browser tells the server, when the server sees the request, it says, oh, okay, this user wants to opt out of both tracking and targeting. And they could also look at this on the client side. So the server receives it. And as a website, you can also run script on your website and use an API to figure out if the user has opted in or out of global privacy control. Next slide, please. How do I know if a website honors this? If you honor global privacy control, you will put on your website at a well-known location a specific file that says GPC true. So next slide, please. You can see that here at the bottom, I went to the Washington Post site and they have GPC equals true, as they're one of the 18 founding organizations of global privacy control. I will note here, like, what does it mean to honor it? What happens if you don't honor it? And these things need to be worked out in legislation, which I'll get to in a moment. Next slide, please. So there's a few browsers that implement the GPC signal, Firefox, Brave, DuckDuckGo, but we really need to be careful here to not repeat the mistakes of the past, like we have with Do Not Track. So we really need the legal backing across jurisdictions, and we also need browsers to cooperate to get this right. The timeline matters here. When is legislation made? When does it go into effect? When are implementations made? When is standardization complete? because what we don't want to get ahead of ourselves where browsers end up implementing things that are different, or browsers end up implementing something that ends up not being what the law states, or not being what we end up standardizing. So the same way that in laws like GDPR, there was an 18-month ramp up period, in standardization and implementation, we need that. Technology needs that too. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so as I said, what does honoring it mean? We need legal backing that's clear. Unfortunately, the enforceability of GPC is a little ambiguous with CCPA, so we'd like to see California and other privacy agencies expressly require businesses to comply with this signal. Because otherwise we will, as I said, just end up repeating the mistakes of the past. Next slide, please. I do want to note here, I talked about meaningful consent. Like, what exactly is meaningful consent? And I don't think that what we see on the internet today is that. Users don't understand what opting in and out of cookies is, or the consequences of doing that. There are things that they do understand, as I mentioned, like when they log into a website, when they fill up a shopping cart, when they see their bank details. So how can we transcend that feeling of like, yes, I am logging into my email and they're storing my email on their servers and I have a relationship with them and I consent to that. Or I'm logging into my bank and I've sent my money to my bank and I have this relationship and I consent to that. How can we transcend that feeling over to these opt-in, opt-outs? And I'm not really sure how. I'm not really sure we can. Maybe we can, maybe we can't. We'll see. I know that there's a lot of debate about this. But this brings me back to that the answer here is not just notice and consent. We really do need this privacy minimum bar that all companies need to abide by. And finally, next slide, please. There's a lot of questions about what is one company doing over another. So how is this law going to be enforced? Are there enforcement clauses? Are there audit clauses? And who's going to do the audit? This reminds me of like PCI compliance and how that works. So what is the equivalent for that for privacy? And who pays for these audits? So things like this need to be worked out as part of the legislation process in order for it to be effective. Now I'm going to hand it back to Rob to go over some examples of HTTP header expressions.
Yes, so just to give a little bit of context, that the header expressions or expressions, for instance, not wanting to be tracked, or maybe information you do not want to be collected, that this is not something from just today. The first example I would like to give dates back from 2011, when I was still working for the Dutch Data Protection Authority. It was actually one of the first enforcement cases that I worked on. It's the Google Street View case, and this was a case when we had Google driving around in vehicles around the street to collect basically the location of Wi-Fi routers in people's homes. And they did so by basically listening into the Wi-Fi networks and picking up the so-called MAC address. Well, we did not talk about MAC addresses yet today. We just touched on IP addresses. Well, when we talk about network communication, and you want to communicate from your browser to a server, you need an IP address for the remote, the distant communication. But for devices that are part of a network, there's also a different identifier, the MAC address, that's used for local communications. And if you drive around and you have a GPS in the car, and you basically start mapping which MAC address you pick up and in which location, you can draw a map. And this map database is called the Geolocation Services by Google. And the Dutch TPA investigated this case, and it turned out that in the settlement, Google had to provide an opt-out for people to express, we do not want to be part of this database. And in order for Google to know if when they update, and they do this continuously now through the mobile phones, their whole database of where each MAC address of Wi-Fi routers is located, you can actually add a text to your network name. And the text is very simple. It's _noma. So Google will receive, and devices will receive, the name of your local network. And this will then actually result to that data not being processed such that it ends up in the Google location database services. And that feature actually is still live. And I will share a URL later on in the chat. Let me actually do that at the moment directly. That's easier to continue my story. And so this is basically a really nice example of an expression through like a header expression. In this case, it's not a technical HTTP header, but it's a header in terms of labeling the network, the Wi-Fi network. There is another type of expression where the header is actually used, and this is in the European context. It's more like not so much in the opt-out discussion, but in the consent discussion, and it's introduced by NOIP, the organization of Max Schrems, and it's called the Advanced Data Protection Control. It's like a GPC version 2 in the European context, because it does not just deal with consent, but also consent revocation. And the example I'm putting here in order to express whether you want to withdraw or opt out for instance, A/B testing, or maybe you want to opt out for all processing that takes place at a data controller that you're interacting with your Internet of Things device, for example. The two sub-examples are here, ADPC, and then withdraw equals Q1 A/B testing, and Q1 is just a identifier to make sure that we're talking about the right type of A/B testing, because there could be multiple ones. And if you would try to opt out for everything, the asterisk would work as well. And these are pieces of information. It's just normal text like you see it in the clear here, which would be on top of the envelope. It will be part of the HTTP header. And that's part of the specification that's being discussed now. In the context of the privacy discussions on the future of, for instance, the GDPR and the so-called Digital Services Act, where much of the cookie discussions are taking place. And it's all about prohibitions for certain types of behavioral advertising, yes or no. It's about consent and consent requirements. It's about dark patterns, but it's also about, it should be as easy to revoke consent as it is to give consent. And in order to facilitate these discussions with technical standards, this is a really interesting example to look into, the Advanced Data Protection Control. Back to you, Van Vee.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just this is our conclusion. I just wanted to say that as browser makers and as an industry, we've put in a lot of restrictions on tracking, ones that we can put in without breaking the web, because there's a lot more we could try, but they would break legitimate functionality. We're working in standards groups like the W3C Privacy Community Group, the Privacy Advertising Technology Group, and others to try to create the next generation of privacy APIs and technologies to make these use cases like login still work with user privacy protections. But we can't do this alone. A lot of this is in your hands. We need, well, legislation. We need informed legislation that understands the tech and puts users first. Without that, we'll end up where we are today with these annoying consent prompts that confuse users and don't give privacy guarantees. So I hope that technology, browser, the tech industry, browser makers, and legislators can work together to put user privacy first and figure out how to do this right.
Well, the 2 points to take home from my side would be, I think the defaults matter, specifically the defaults in the browser. Many users will not go through the difficulties in going to the settings and understand what the different settings mean. So it's very important that the defaults are set in such a way that it's privacy friendly. The other thing I think to take home from this presentation is that definitions matter as well, because it needs to be clear what is part of the scope of the definition that's being used in terms of the processing or the opt-out, or maybe even for what are you consenting to. And having been part of the whole do not track discussion from 2011 all the way up to 2019, many of the discussions were about differences of different viewpoints on definitions and on scope. And in order to avoid these, it's important that regulators draft really clear laws as well. So with that, I'm going to give back to our moderator, Stacey, to most likely open up for discussion.
Excellent. Yes, thank you, Rob. Thank you, Tanvi. I will take the slides down in a moment, but before I do, I'll just leave our contact information up here for just a moment in case anyone would like to follow up with us. And we've got 15 minutes set aside for questions. We've got a number of them already in the Q&A, put more in there. And I think, Sherry, you're going to start us off.
Yeah, just again, with the practitioner hat on. So as things stand today, when I go to the GPC site and try to make sense of it as a non-technical lawyer, albeit with a kid who's majoring in computer science, there's a lot of language that it's not yet done, that it's incomplete. So my question for you is, if we're advising clients who are reading the AG's guidance that seems to suggest they should be moving towards implementing this, what should they be doing? Can they easily implement it? And what does that, and how can they advertise it in a way? It sounds like it will only work on those 3 browsers. So I guess the question is, if companies are going to go to the GPC website and get the header information that they need, is that going to, will they be able to implement it, or do they have to have a disclaimer that it only works for if you're on these browsers?
So as far as the legal backing and how that works, I'm not a lawyer. I can't comment all of that on all that. But I can say that what you can do, the way these 18 founding organizations have done, is that you can say, I want to honor this signal. And I understand that it's still in process, it's still being standardized, it's still being legalized, but I want to honor it. So when I see it, when I see a user has chosen to use one of these browsers and opt into global privacy control, then when I see that header, I'll say, okay, I know what this user wants from me. They don't want me to track them. They don't want me to target them, and I will honor that. And it will take time for legislation to catch up, for standardization to catch up, and for all the browsers to implement this. But as I said before, the timeline is really important. And somebody asked in the Q&A, like, how is this different than do not track? Well, because we did do not track and we saw what failed. And I hope that as an industry, we can recognize our mistakes and say, like, okay, now we know we really need the legislative backing. We need to work on that before we just go off and say, okay, all browsers are doing this, everyone go adhere to this. Without that backing, it's not going to get us anywhere, I think.
Let me add that the specification is actually relatively simple. And the fact that not all browsers implemented GPC doesn't mean you can start preparing for what to do when you receive an expression of a GPC, which means do not sell or share my personal information. I mean, to develop policies around that, what it actually means for that company, and that the feature is actually live is already a big thing. So my point is, organizations that want to adhere to a GPC do not have to wait until browsers have technically developed to embed this technology. And it's not just browsers. In the near future, we'll see Internet of Things devices, which we will use in our wrist watches and like for smart payments, etc. All different types of instruments that will be connected to the internet, most of these will have the ability to either express consent or revoke consent, but also to be able to express opt-outs. And if we always want to wait until all these devices have embedded and adopted, then obviously nothing is going to change. So it's important we have clear laws, but it's also important for people who receive these wishes of users and these expressions of not selling and sharing their information, to be able to detect that and to also translate that into, okay, but this is what it means. This is what we do with it.
And so if a company has third-party cookies on its site, and it receives a GPC signal, then it's should be technically able to communicate with those third-party not to track this user?
Yes, so the first step is to interpret the headers. So they receive communication signals, and on top of that envelope, there could be a GPC expression. But there's also the opportunity with JavaScript, with programming code, to read the settings, the default settings of the browser remotely to see, okay, does this user actually made a choice to enable or maybe disable the opt-out? Once you know what the expression of the user is, you can convey that on the server side all through the value chain with the different vendors that you work with. And that doesn't necessarily have to be in the same format, doesn't have to necessarily be in the same header technology. The header technology is designed to communicate with end users, with people who visit your website. And there are different technologies to convey that message all the way through the value chain. So yes, it is possible to convey that with others.
We don't know exactly what, I don't know exactly what adhering to GPC means, but let's say for a second it means the same thing as when a user opts in or opts out of that cookie prompt. So you could say that if a user has sent this signal and you see it, then you can even do this in JavaScript on your page. Say, is this signal there? Yes, it is. Okay, then I'm not going to show my cookie banner. I already know my answer. I'm not going to interrupt this user.
Rob, can you speak a little bit to what's happening in Europe around this and maybe similar signals? Because if I understand it correctly, the regime of opt-outs, much less universal opt-outs, is not as prevalent in the EU as it is in the United States.
Yeah, that's true. But although I have to emphasize that in the current privacy law, the General Data Protection Regulation, we have Article 21.5, which speaks specifically to opting out. And that is also possible with expressions through like browser settings. Similar type of wording is used in the current cookie laws, where in the so-called Recital 66, the expression through browser settings is accepted by the legislator, European legislator. And similar to like future law in terms of the e-privacy regulation, future law for cookies, also copies a similar type of language where opt-out signals like GPC, but also conveying consent through browser headers is something that the legislator took on board and has not been contested by the industry. There is so much happening there, specifically in the European Parliament and in the Council of Europe, because we have a co-legislative approach towards European laws. Because the e-privacy discussion and the future laws for cookies have been stalled for many years already, you see that many of the pressing problems are now drafted in new laws like the Digital Services Act, which I touched upon a little bit earlier already. All that taken into account, new technologies like connected cars, but also we have like smart cities and Internet of Things, like big technological developments, because our whole societies are digitizing, will have an effect on, do we want like a consent driven future in terms of the digitization? This may well work for some use cases, but many use cases do not work on informed consent. And with that, I mean, for instance, technologies in the public space where you move around freely. most of those are based on radio signals. And this means you can already be subjected to data processing, which is protected by privacy law, when you're like 150 meters away from the sign that explains you what it means. So before you could actually exercise your user controls. And for like opting out from Wi-Fi tracking is very difficult. So there is a continuous discussion on, okay, but how does this apply to future technologies, and specifically with smart cities and Internet of Things in mind, we see that there are limitations to the consent model. And this is why expressions in technology, embedded in technological protocols is important, and is also part of the legislative discussions that are happening at the moment.
Thanks, Rob. Tanvi, we've got a question about the trend of ad tech generally with the deprecation of third-party cookies that you may want to speak to.
Sure. So with the deprecation of third-party cookies, certain trackers and data brokers have started to try to leverage the first-party cookies instead. And this is really tricky because we need first-party cookies, right, to provide user privacy. When a data broker is trying to hijack first-party cookies, we could say, well, let's just forget about first-party cookies, and then the web wouldn't work, right? You can't log into anything, you can't store a shopping cart. So we have to take a really fine balance on how we're going to do this. How can we block this type of more invasive tracking techniques while still preserving web functionality? And browsers are working on that with it's kind of a cat and mouse game where we continue to add more mitigations to block these type of things. And there's technical challenges, and we're working through those. But at least I feel like there's some kind of sense of understanding that browsers are trying to mitigate this. We are talking about these things in the privacy community group and other places. This is a place where legislation can help too, right? We can only go so far without breaking the web. So legislation coming in and saying, well, you know what, these types of invasive tracking practices, they're not allowed. And that would help.
Thanks. That's really helpful. And we've got another sort of big picture question that I'm going to toss your way, Rob, which is, tell us about your perspective on the future. Are we in 5-10 years going to have universal profiles where people manage their identity and their privacy settings? Is one of the questions from the Q&A.
Yeah, this is Scott's question. I see it here. It's a very intriguing question because it sees to, okay, what's the next version of the internet going to look like? And we see all this discussion on like Web3, blockchain technologies, which means that there are some use cases where it's very important to know who the person is that you're communicating or doing business with. So these are identity-driven use cases. And we're talking about digitization of money, but also, for instance, in Europe, like a federal European identity. For that, it's important to be able to go back to the point of origin when you were like given your social security number, for example, like or your birth name, to be able to go back to that first moment when you were born, and that chain of identity needs to remain valid and transparent as well. These are like blockchain type of use cases where a very strong universal profile may help, like an extended passport, for example. But a spin-off of this type of identity thinking is more like the information pod idea, where you are in control of your own set of attributes, who you want to disclose. Maybe if you want to do shopping, you just want to disclose your payment details, but you do not, and maybe your email address if you want to stay in touch and get discounts, for instance. But there are other attributes that are not relevant for that shopping interaction. And by having control on this like personal privacy pods, that's like a concept that's being explored as well. And the term that you could use on Google here, just look for it, or another search engine, is the VRM technology. It's vendor relation management, which puts the user in control of its own information in terms of what attributes do I share in which context, and also be able to revoke certain types of information that you've disclosed at some point. And then this is like more the third bucket. Obviously, there will be universal profiling aspects that we may see now already with digital advertising. I'm not sure where this will land, because we see a lot of decentralization. Like universal profile, to me, connotates to like a more central type of idea about personal attributes. That's certainly the case in many of the advertising technology networks that we see there today. But I'm not sure that's going to be future-proof. I see a lot of pushback by regulators, specifically in the edtech space, because it's questionable whether these universal profiles and the data that's added to these profiles is actually collected lawfully and still processed lawfully. So that's why we see contextual advertising models being proposed, but also that's why Google is trying to deprecate the third-party cookie in the first part, the cookies in the third-party context, but also thinking about, okay, where do we need to trade the information about the advertisement? Does that need to be in the advertising network as done now, or maybe we can shift that in the browser itself, such that it's more privacy friendly and the user has much more control, and we do not have to disclose everything that's part of that universal profile to everybody for unknown purposes. So share with unknown parties for unknown purposes, but to have much more control and to limit the attributes that are really needed to disclose from this universal profile just for the purposes that are needed. So these are just my outlook towards the future. Will be much more sensitive what we share with whom for which purposes.
Thanks, Rob. And I think this will be clear to people who made it this far in the webinar, but can you define contextual advertising in one or two sentences?
Maybe there are two examples that come to mind. First one is Ster in the Netherlands. It's a public broadcasting organization. They use the subtitles of all the video content to derive keywords, whether you're watching sports TV or maybe you're watching the news, and use that information in the current advertising ecosystem to buy and sell advertisements. Everybody gets the same unique identifier. So the information on who sees what advertisement is not stored in the universal profile. Well, it's universal as in everybody has the same profile. The other one is the Norwegian organization called Kobler, and Kobler does something similar. They are experimenting with not just natural language processing, which is deriving information about audiences based on text, but also about how do you translate it into video. So contextual advertising and based on the information that you consume and not so much about your previous browsing history and how you use the web.
Thank you. That's a good place to end. Tanvi, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, that covered it. Thank you very much.
It was a very solid place to end. Thank you both so much. And Sherry, we had an announcement just today from the California Privacy Protection Agency, right? To one of the questions about whether they're looking at more detailed rules.
Yeah, so somebody asked, what is the agency doing around this issue? And CPRA directs them to engage in rulemaking around this issue. And in fact, they are. Just today, they issued a notice that they're going to have these informational sessions, frankly, much like what we're doing. And they're going to have one on global privacy controls, and that will take place on March 29th. They're having a 2-day, they have a packed agenda for 2 days. The first day is March 29th, beginning at 11 o'clock Pacific time. And this issue is on the docket. And so, stay tuned. Well, we'll see. And of course, the executive director, for those of you that don't know, the person who was chosen as the executive director of the agency, he was really one of the main organizers of the gpc.org organization, or I don't, Tanvi, maybe I'm not saying organization, but group.
He was one of the founders, and then now he's, with the California.
Yeah.
I think it's the CPPA agency.
CPRA, yeah. So he's going to, I'm sure, add, some information about it as well. Yeah. So
and I just wanted to jump in on one thing. I don't see the question now, but there was a question about like, should the legislation be principled or granular, as far as like, this is the principle or these are the things that you must do. I think it should actually be both, because if you just make it granular, then in the future, there will be no more techniques that evade this and they won't be covered. And if you just make it principled, it's too vague. So making it principled, getting into the granular of what that means, and then evolving it in a couple of years and saying, well, actually, it also means these other things that we've seen creep up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's all. Thank you.
That's really helpful and a great question to whoever wrote it. So
that was a great question.
Thank you so much, Rob, Tanvi, Sherry. This is our last session for a little while, but FPF and California Lawyers Association are going to continue partnering on informational and educational sessions this year. Excited to bring you more guest experts and more content. So if you're interested in hearing about those in the future, more sessions like this on GPC and other topics, subscribe to either of our organizations to stay in touch. And thank you so much for spending your lunch hour with us.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to FPF for partnering with us. And it's been and will continue to be a pleasure to work with Stacy. So thank you. And everybody at FPF.
It's been awesome. Thanks, folks. Please keep joining.